let's get started. I think most of you know me. I'm Clinton Jenkins. I'm a professor here in the department, also Latin American Caribbean Center. I'm hosting our guest today, Dr. Marconi Campos. He's a colleague of mine for about 10 years ago. We met. So I'd like all of you to welcome him. He's coming from Puerto Rico, although his native country is Brazil. I think we'll talk a little bit about some research going on there. Marconi did his undergraduate degree in, your undergraduate was? In Bega, in Minas Gerais in Brazil. Then he did a master's degree in biology, ecology at the INPA, the National Institute of Amazonian Research in Manaus in Brazil, and did a PhD in ecology at the University of Puerto Rico, where he stayed. Right, he seems to have liked Puerto Rico, so he's been hanging around there for 7 or 8 years. He has done some of the leading or cutting edge research on ecoacoustics and biological monitoring for biodiversity, threats, deforestation, hunting, things like that. So he's going to share some of his research today with us on that topic. And then afterwards at 5:30, yes, we're going to have a dinner at the Shoma Bazaar in Doral. If people want to join us there, let us know so we can try and reserve a spot. That's much more informal if you want to continue the conversation there and have a bite to eat, maybe something to drink. Okay, so welcome, Marconi. I will hand it off to you.
Can you hear me well?
Turn it off.
Yeah, this can turn on. Hey,
I think it turns off on that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the green light.
The flashing, I need to wait until it's full green, right?
Why's it flashing?
Okay, why don't you, would you mind? Yeah.
Oh, it's,
Yeah,
it's,
there
it's
you go.
working. All right. Thank you again. Thank you, Clinton. It's such a pleasure to be here today. First of all, I just want to thank you again for inviting me. I'm super happy to be here. Thank you, Cara, for all the organization. As Clinton said, I met him in Brazil like a while ago. And I think that I never told you that, but your work really was inspired for me because like Clinton worked a lot on mapping out biodiversity, and that's exactly what we are trying to do, but now using acoustics. So let me start the talk today is really on explaining how we are using ecoacoustics or passive acoustic monitoring to better protect and improve the way that we are monitoring biodiversity. And I will be focusing a little bit more on the tropics. That is where mainly of our work is happening right now. But before I do that, I think it's over here. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I can. Oh, perfect. And now the mic is dead. Oh. I can use
The microphone, maybe. You got it. So one more time.
Push the button.
Yeah, there, you good.
Yeah. So just a little bit about myself. As Clinton said, I'm from Brazil, so you will be hearing like a very weird accent. I started my career working with a bird. This specific guy here, it's a Brazilian merganser. It's a very weird and peculiar species. It's a very specialist species. It occurs only on a few places in Brazil, and it's completely adapted and specialist to these habitats here. It needs to be clear water in the mountains. It's hunting through vision. It's using vision to hunt those little fishes. And one of the things that it's a endemic species, only occurring in Brazil. It's super rare and is threatened to extinction, mainly because most of these the habitats are endangered, right? Like we cannot find those pristine, transparent waters anymore in Brazil. And that was that was really shocking. Like why I was just starting my career and trying to find a species and estimate a population. And we were really trying to get into, like I was picking maps and trying to understand exactly where were those streams that could be conserved and protected. And every time that we tried to reach those places, we could see an environment that was similar to this one here, with a lot of garbage, mining, contamination by cattle. Right at the beginning, I also started using acoustics to help me study biodiversity, because to try to find that species that is so rare, I needed to play back the species call, like I was walking through those rivers and play back the species call to see if I have any response by that species. At the same time as well, I started, like recording other birds as well. So I'm an ornithologist by training. I started, going out in the field and try to identify, understand what species were there. So those are some of the environments that where I was recording species. Probably most of you are not very familiar. Those are this was my original equipment at that moment. Like huge tape recorders that literally gave me pain in the neck because it was super heavy, super awkward to go with that in the forest. But it really helped me to identify species. And at that point as well, it became super clear to me that I needed to rely more and more on the species sounds, on acoustics. And why was that? Because I was there mainly when I was using this device here, I was trying to record the species so that I can then do some playbacks. I can play back the call of the species, the song of the species, and attract the species so that I can see it and then identify that species. But then again, like I said, it became super clear that I needed to rely more and more on acoustics, because there was a lot of species that I could not, like by looking at their colors, I could not really identify the species. And that was the moment that I realized that I was color blinded. So I couldn't, it was my nightmare. Those folks here, those were my nightmare, because they are all brownish with a little bit red and orange. And I couldn't see, I couldn't see the difference. But if they call or song, I will definitely able to distinguish each one of them. So again, it became very clear to me that I needed to focus more on acoustics. As I said to you, in my early career, I was impacted by how the environment around me was degraded. And one of my dreams was always to go to the Amazon so that I could actually see some of those species that used to occur in my state. For example, the jaguar, the macaw, all those species used to occur they still occur in some places in Minas Gerais over here. But they are super rare. They're like, it's super hard to see them. So I went to the Amazon to work there, and I was full of expectations again to see all those incredible animals in the jungle. And one more time, I was able to see that, like, it's not that easy to see species in the forest, right? Like, so when I went to the Amazon, this is a photo, and I'm here. I don't know if you can see me here, but I'm here. This is me here when I had a lot of more hair. And the forest, like the trees are so tall, the vegetation is so dense, there are so many layers, it's almost impossible to actually see all those species. But if you close your eyes and you really pay attention, you will see like a huge party, like a cacophony of sounds in the forest. And you can identify species by their sounds. And then I really started, I accepted my faith, like, okay, let's use acoustics. There's no way to escape from it. And I started creating my own devices to deploy in the forest. So I started, there was an improvement from those huge tape recorders. and now I was using MP3 players. I don't know if you guys know about MP3 players. That doesn't exist anymore, I think, right? But I was really trying to be creative and create ways to record the forest. After that, I went to, so what happened with me is that, like I started putting those devices there out in the forest. And at the end of my master, I had almost like 10 terabytes of data, and I couldn't actually listen to all of that data. I needed help. I needed to find a way that I can process all the 10 terabytes of data that I have. And then I met a professor in Puerto Rico. He was developing a platform that I will be talking about that platform today a lot, called Arbimon, in which it is possible for you to use AI models to automatically identify species in the audio recordings. So what I did was, and then a new improvement, I already using like now cell phones to record birds in the forest and frogs as well. And in my PhD in Puerto Rico, what I did was deploying those audio devices across an elevational gradient so that I can really understand how species, birds and frogs, were responding to climate change, if they were like going up in the mountain or not. I will be talking and give you some examples of the findings of those works in a few more slides. But one of the things, again, that became very clear to me, as I said to you, is that especially our generation, we were born in a moment where the degradation was everywhere in the ecosystem. So I will state the obvious that we already know, everyone know, that we are passing through a biodiversity crisis. We are seeing population declines of several birds, of several species all around the world, not only in the tropics, it's literally all around the world. And the population decline is that we are seeing are, we are seeing population decline of frogs, birds, fishes, mammals, and there's a lot of debate, about the magnitude of these declines and the biodiversity crisis, right? Like some folks say that no, that is not that bad, and some folks saying that it's way worse than what we are seeing. But it doesn't matter, well, it matters, but the truth is, there is no, just looking at the night light from the world, our planet, we can see that we as humans are occupying the entire globe, and there is no way that we will not have any effect on the biodiversity, right? So again, we really need to be creative and innovative to really try to understand and study those species and protect those species. Fortunately, there are some good news. In 2022, we have the COP15 in Montreal, where it was established the Global Biodiversity Framework, which proposed 23 action-oriented targets to be achieved by 2030. That includes the conservation of 30% of the world's land, the restoration of 30% of the degraded lands, and reducing human-induced species extinction. So those are pretty bold targets, right? Especially if we want to achieve those by 2030. And that's why, again, we really need to be creative and we need to act fast if we want to achieve any of those goals. And not only that, to achieve some of those goals, conservation, improve restoration, we need to go to the basics, and we really need to understand what is happening with biodiversity in the landscape, right? Currently, we have made some amazing advances on monitoring forest cover at a global scale, right? Right now, we can map forest cover across at a global scale almost in real time. But the truth is, we do not know what is happening with the animals inside those forests. We can track the forest, but we cannot track the animals inside those forests. And there are some basic questions that need to be answered if we want to achieve some of those targets. We really need to understand where the species are. When we look at one of this landscape here, like a tropical Amazon forest, it's hard just by looking at this picture to understand like what are the species that are occurring here. So we really need to understand what species are in this landscape, how common they are, where they are distributed in the landscape, and how dynamic are their population. If they are increasing, the population increasing, if the population are facing a decline. And like I said, we really need to be creative and act fast. And we are seeing some good, advances in technology that could help us to achieve some of those, to answer some of those questions. Camera trap is something that have been used for a while now. There are now a lot of folks using drones to monitor biodiversity. There is transmitting colors, and today we will be focused on sound recorders, on passive acoustic monitoring. So passive acoustic monitoring, or ecoacoustics, as you will see, is a combination of ecology and using bioacoustics to study biodiversity. And it consists basically on deploying those specialized autonomous audio devices in the landscape. And what we are measuring when we are putting those devices out in the forest. So we as humans, we are very visual beings, right? Like we really need to see something. So one good thing about the, like the soundscape ecology and ecoacoustic or passive acoustic monitoring is that we can actually translate audio and visualize that audio. And that is what we are going to be seeing in a lot of those slides that will come in the next few minutes. This is a spectrogram. So what is it? I will try to teach you quickly on how to read a spectrogram. So here we have time in seconds. So it's just 44 seconds of audio. And here we have frequency. So low frequency is like low frequency sounds, and high frequency are high pitched sounds, right? And well, it's a little bit like blurry, but each one of those, yeah, I don't know if you can see that well, yeah. But there are a lot of acoustic events happening here. And I would like to ask you guys right now, if you can, maybe you can close your eyes or just like focus on this recording that I will play right now, and tell me how many species you think is present in these 40 seconds. I don't know how to stop this, but can you guess how many species? 14. Wow, that's amazing. That's right on the spot. Like there's no chance for everyone else. But anyone was like thinking other numbers? Like how many species? 11? It was 14. Actually, I think it's even more than 14 species. Depending on how much we know about the insects that are occurring in the soundscape. And for me, that is the true power of sound, right? Like it's the ability that we have to detect in 40 seconds. It's just 40 seconds. We have 14 species. And not only that, we have different taxonomic groups, right? Like I'm an ornithologist by training. I really love birds, but you know, like the mics are out there recording everything. So we have birds, we have primates, we have insects, we have frogs, And not only that, with the sounds, we can also capture species behavior and understand sometimes if you have male, female, juvenile, adults, and even trying to understand what they are doing, for example. Besides that, okay, let me pause. Okay, yeah. Like I said, the mic doesn't know that I like birds. It's recording everything. And then the power of the sound is also on our ability to describe the soundscapes. So let me play some of those sounds to you here. And maybe, yeah, you can tell me if you like that sound or not. It's no? Yes? Okay. Overall, great sound, right? So it's so interesting, like depending on the audience, like there are some folks that like are scared about the sounds of the forest and prefer the sounds of an urban area. And I hope that here we are much more connected to nature, that we prefer the sounds from nature instead of the urban environment. But the idea is that you can not only detect the species, but you can have like information about the landscape itself, right? Like, so the first sound that we heard here is what we call geophony. So the sounds produced by the earth itself. So thunder, the rain, the wind, the rivers, the streams. Then we have biophony. They are the sounds produced by animals. And finally, we have anthropophony, that sounds produced by human. And with that information, we can really characterize an entire landscape. And again, not only that, we can convert those sounds into a matrix. And this is the soundscape. I will be explaining a little bit more on how to read this soundscape, but we can really plot that out and understand exactly and quantify that. So there is a lot of benefits of using ecoacoustics or passive acoustic monitoring to understand and improve the way that we are monitoring biodiversity. It provides a less invasive technique, so you are not disrupting the animal's behaviors in that landscape. It can cover large areas, so different from camera trap that usually you are really focused on one specific angle. With acoustics, you're really recording everything, almost like a sphere around the device itself. It provides us with the ability to have long continuous recordings so that we can put the devices there for days, weeks, months, and even years in the field. We can survey multiple sites and multiple species and different taxonomic groups simultaneously. And I think my favorite of all probably is that we have a permanent recorder, right? So it's almost that you have, like, remember, in 40 seconds, we had 14 species. So it's almost like a museum collection. Like you can go back there and you can reassess and identify and cross-check and revalidate what the species that were recorded there. So all those characteristics really help us to decrease the on-the-ground effort, time, and the cost on monitoring biodiversity. And that is exactly what we are doing in Rainforest Connection. So Rainforest Connection is a nonprofit organization really dedicated to use the power of sound to protect and improve the way that we are monitoring biodiversity. And we have like two main streams in Rainforest Connection. One of them is the threat detection, is really using sound to detect the sounds of illegal activities such as chainsaw, illegal, so that we get capturing illegal logging, gunshot, vehicles, dog barking. And the other stream is the biodiversity monitoring. I will be focusing a little bit more on the biodiversity monitoring today, but just to give you some idea on how we are using this threat detection system, We have those devices here that we call them guardians. They are deployed in the canopy of the forests. They have these solar panels, so they can be there in the forest recording 24/7. And the idea, you can have an AI model inside the device or up in the cloud. And every time that you detect the sound of illegal activity, it will send an alert in real time to the local communities or to the rangers, so they can quickly respond and stop the illegal activity. The other component is the biodiversity monitoring, and this is our basically workflow when using ecoacoustics for biodiversity monitoring. We always started by understanding exactly what are the ecological questions, the conservation goal, because that will help us determine what will be the best sampling design. So what that means, where exactly in the landscape you are going to be deploying the devices, what will be the configuration of those devices, if you want to record 1 minute every 5 minutes, 1 minute every 10 minutes continuously. After that, we definitely need to go out in the field. We can use the guardians, as I showed you, but also we use the offline devices, the Arbimon devices. They are super small, they fit in the palm of your hand, and they cost like around $60. So it's super affordable, super easy to deploy in the field. We spread them out, we live for like weeks, months, we retrieve everything, we upload everything into Arbimon, the platform that I'm going to be talking the next slide, but is a web-based platform that allows us to upload, store, manage, analyze recordings. And then we will pass through a passes of some different analysis. The first one is the acoustic analysis, where we are really trying to extract presence and absence data from the raw soundscape recordings. And in this case, we will be using a combination of unsupervised and supervised analysis, including clustering, pattern matching, AI models. And then with the presence and absence that we acquire here, we will be combining that presence and absence with environmental and bioclimatic variables so that we can really get and make sense of the data, really get into the ecological insights. So we will be estimating species richness, species compositions, activity patterns, occupants models, and really close the cycle and answer the original question that we have. And as I said, at the heart of our organization is the Arbimon platform. So this is a web-based free platform that allows everyone, not only the scientific community, to store, manage, and analyze their data. So you can upload as many recordings as you want. You don't need to have any coding skills to actually use the platform. And right now, we have more than 4,000 species documented in the system. We have recordings coming from 160 countries around the world. We have more than 4,000 projects inside the platform and more than 133 million recordings in the platform. And here's just like a map showing where we have recordings coming from. You can see we are doing like a pretty good job on mapping out the soundscape in the Americas, not so much in Africa, Russia, India. So we still have some gaps that we want to fulfill in the next few years. But as you can see, we are doing, and the results that we are seeing are really matching up with the patterns of biodiversity that we already know, where we have more species richness in these high tropical biodiversity areas. And one of the other things that we are doing is really combining machine learning and cloud computing so that we can have those AI models that like allow us to achieve high precision and accuracy on extracting presence and absence from the raw soundscape recordings. Currently, we have more than 10 regional CNN models with each one of those have like 100 species on it. And I will not try to explain exactly what is a CNN model, like a convolutional neural network, but it's basically a machine learning model. It's learning with the data that you are providing to it. I will explain a little bit more in the next slides our pipeline to train those models. But we currently have CNN models for Panama, Ecuador, Puerto Rico, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Sumatra, Borneo, Italy, and Finland. And finally, after you get your presence and absence data, we have created another tool that we are calling Ecological Insights, Arbimon Insights, where you can actually interact with the results. You can see how many species you have. You can see like a heat map or where the species are. You can see how the number of species are changing through time. If you click on one single species, you can actually see a photo of the species, a clip of the species, a quick description, the map, and you can like really explore the detections. And again, the idea was to create a tool that not only favor the scientific community, but everyone have access and are able to interact with the data. So currently we have projects. So the platform is free. So that 4,000 projects that I mentioned before, it's a combination of the community contributing to that platform, but we also, Rainforest Connection, we are executing some of those projects ourselves. So we have projects in Brazil, tracking restoration progress. We have some projects in Puerto Rico where we are studying the impact of climate change on birds and frogs. In Peru, monitoring anthropogenic impacts. Madagascar, Tanzania, Indonesia. And let me just go with you through some of those projects. And I will try using some of those projects to like give you guys a little bit more details about each one of those steps that I mentioned before. So let's start by focusing on Puerto Rico, right? Puerto Rico is such an interesting place because it's one of the fewest places in the globe where we actually have more reforestation than deforestation. So after the 1940s, most of the agricultural lands were abandoned in the island, and then the vegetation is naturally coming back. We do have some urbanization expansion occurring, especially near the main cities, like the San Juan, the capital. And we do have climate change impacting the entire island. We frequently hurricanes, we have drought, we have climate change. So it's a very interesting place to be studying biodiversity. Not only that, we have a lot of endemic species that only occur in Puerto Rico. And most of those endemic species, they are really threatened to extinction. So in collaboration with Recursos Naturales, it's the local environmental agency in Puerto Rico, Fish and Wildlife, and the local NGO Para la Naturaleza, we came out with this amazing project where we were able to deploy 1,200 sites across the entire archipelago of Puerto Rico. So not only on the mainland, but also on the small little islands around Puerto Rico. So currently we have more than 7 million recordings coming from this project. It's a beautiful project. There's a lot of students contributing on collecting the data, analyzing the data, supporting us on each step of this project. So here just to show, we climbing trees to deploy the guardians. Those are the offline devices that I told you, and just like a picture of Puerto Rico. So trying to expand on the details of our workflow. We go out there, we deploy those devices in the field, we collect the recordings, we upload everything to Arbimon. And the first step is really to collect some examples so that we can start creating and training an AI model. So the first step is really here we have the spectrogram, again, time and frequency. And every time that we find, like a good example of the species call, we create a box around it and we put a name on that box. So the templates that we are using, it's basically like a good example of the species call. Here we have like the call of the white-throated toucan. This is an example of a good template. And then the first step is to use a very basic but powerful algorithm to detect additional sounds in your raw soundscape recording. So you just need one example of the species call, like was here before, and you take that example. So let's say again, repeat it. You take that example and you pass that example through the raw soundscape recordings. And every time that you have like a good correlation between the template that you selected and the sound in the raw soundscape recordings, you have a good match. So it's a correlation algorithm, right? So as you can see, it will be moving through the soundscape, the spectrogram, and when you have like a good match, that is what the system will do. It will capture that clip and will present that clip to you. So that is basically the platform that we have, where we have only one example of the species call. And then those are all the clips that were detected by the algorithm. And then the human expert needs to go out there and say, okay, this is indeed my species, or no, that's not my species. And that is what we are using to train the AI models, right? Remember, it's a machine learning model, so it's learning with your data. So you really need to provide example of the species presence and example of the species absence. So true positives and true negatives. We always, like I said, like we are converting everything into the spectrogram so that you can see, visualize, and that is what we are using in the model itself, is the spectrograms. And then we use a pre-trained model. So currently we are using a model that is actually trained on image, not necessarily on sound, to reach the species classification model. And here's the result of Puerto Rico. Those are the species, and here's the average precision for each species. So as you can see, we are able to achieve high precision on identifying the species. In Puerto Rico, we are focusing on 41 species, and those species that we are focused are species of great conservation need, meaning species that are endemic, threatened, or data deficient. So the next step for us is once we pass the CNN model, what we will have is presence and absence data plotted in a map, right? Like, so here the blue dots are where we have species presence, and the black dots is where we have a device, but we couldn't detect the species. So with that information, with presence and absence in the landscape, we will combine that with environmental and bioclimatic variables so that we can get into the species distribution maps or species occupants maps. And what this is doing is really creating a continuous superficie for the probability that the species are actually occurring in that area. Because it doesn't matter that I put like 1,000 devices across the entire archipelago. We know that there are places here that we couldn't really sample. So we want to extrapolate and really understand what are the environmental variables that are affecting and driving the species occupancy. And in Puerto Rico, we actually took like an additional step, that we not only generate those maps for the current period, but also we did that for the historical period, and we also did that for the future period using green gas emission scenarios. But not only that, we, instead of doing what most of folks are doing right now, that is basically like comparing current versus future distribution and proposing like new protected areas, we actually focused on areas that were always suitable for the species. Doesn't matter the time period, and that's what that way we are dealing with uncertainty with the modeling approach, but also trying to focus on those areas that were really refugia for the species. So we did that for 13 of those critical species, like the species of great conservation need. So those are the like the always suitable areas for each one of the bird species. We did that also for frogs, and then we overlap that information, and we overlap that information with also the network, the current network of protected areas in Puerto Rico, as you can see here. And unfortunately, we have like not a very good result. Now, right, what we have found is that unfortunately there is a mismatch between current protected areas and suitable habitat under climate change scenarios. So what we found is that 80% of the always suitable areas, it's actually outside protected areas. So what that means, it means that if we really want to protect species under climate change scenarios, we need again to be very creative and think in different ways to we can either expand the network of protected areas, creating new protected areas, create buffers around protected areas. We can even need to, we may need to think about translocating species and populations as well, because the truth is species are not waiting on us or politicians to actually move. They are moving, right? Like they are responding to climate change. And we really need to rethink the way that we are establishing and protecting our, the network of protected areas. And I just want to mention that this is, for me, one of the, like, that's the dream of the, like all biologists and ecologists in conservation, because the environmental agents, U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Recursos Naturales de Puerto Rico, they are actually using that information to buy and acquire new land, new pieces of land to increase the network of protected areas. So super exciting to see that actually happening while you are still alive, you know? The other interesting information coming from this Puerto Rico project is really related to the soundscape. So before I try to explain a little bit about those results, let us just like go back to what is soundscape and how can we interpret and understand what is a soundscape and how can we quantify soundscape. So imagine that you put a device out there in the field and you're recording 1 minute every 5 minutes. So you will have a bunch of like spectrograms, clips, 1 minute. So imagine now that you are going to put everything together. You will be overlapping all those 1 minute recordings. And then when you do that, you will have this kind of map here where, again, you still have hours here and frequency here. And the warm colors, meaning that you have a lot of acoustic activity happening. And the blue colors here is that you don't have like a lot of acoustic activity. So here we have a soundscape for Puerto Rico and the Peruvian Amazon, 2 tropical sites, but you can easily see that they are pretty different, right? Like what are the differences that really pops up here when comparing those 2 soundscapes?
The silence during the midday. Yes.
What do you say?
It's quieter during the middle of the day.
Exactly. So here, so one of the things, yeah, that's one of the things, like you can easily see a pattern here, right? Like in Puerto Rico, you can see a lot of vocal activity happening during the night, not much during the day, but you have like other frequencies being used during the day compared to the nocturnal period. Any other interpretation?
Second one is similar to the first one, that there's less activity during the nighttime hours. There's less density in the middle of that second one.
Oh, yeah.
Versus the edges of it, which looks similar to the first one, it's just more dense. It's a lot.
Right. Yeah. Maybe what you're trying to say, like dense, I don't know if that's what you're trying to say, but one of the things that really pops out here is that this soundscape is much more saturated, right? Like it's much more occupied than this one here. This one that is like, you can see a clear pattern. Here is a little bit like messy, but it's much more occupied. And one of the things that we discover is that how much, like the number of species in a location really contributes to the saturation of the soundscape. So soundscapes, they are very saturated, like this one have more species than soundscape like this one, right? So this is one of the ways that we are using to quantify soundscape and compare soundscape across different land use types. But not only that, we can see how saturated the soundscape is, and that is a good proxy of species richness. but also we can try to understand soundscape composition. So here again, I have Puerto Rico, lowland and high elevation areas. And again, you can see that in the lowland is more saturated. We have the acoustic space is more occupied versus this one. But the composition really matters. When we look at the sources of those sounds, we could see that here in the lowland, we have more species, right? Which again, agrees with our, the pattern of like high saturation, more species. Then, like more species here than in the high elevation areas. But here we have all those three are endemic and threatened species. And here we all have like common species. So not only saturation or species richness is important, but also composition really matters. And what we are seeing in Puerto Rico trying to like interpret these results is that for some locations in the island, we have data for 3 years now, and we are entering the 4th year this year. And one of the things that we see is the saturation didn't change across the years, which is good, meaning the number of species are relatively constant. But when we look at the different protected areas, so we have like 6 protected areas here, we can see that there are differences in the saturation. Some areas we have less saturated soundscape, and some areas we have like high saturated soundscape. And what is really interesting is that those here that are less saturated, those are in dry forests. And here we have like wet forests. And again, we can see the same pattern, like number of species of birds and frogs are correlated with soundscape saturation. And again, when we look at the composition itself of the soundscape, we can see similar pattern. It doesn't matter like the year is not really telling us a lot about how the composition of the soundscape is changing. What really is influencing the soundscape composition is the location itself. And again, we are seeing a gradient of humidity here. So we have here the places where is dry and hot, and here is wet. Well, everything is hot in Puerto Rico, but it's dry and wet here. I think, yeah, maybe I can just.
Yeah, about 10 more minutes, we can do.
Yeah, 10 minutes. Yeah.
Questions.
Okay, just to show a little bit about Brazil. Like, so going back to Brazil, in this restoration project in Atlantic Forest in Brazil, it's a beautiful place, super high biodiversity. It's a hotspot, a lot of endemics, a lot of threatened species, unfortunately. And we are collaborating with 2 nonprofits. One is WeForest, the other one is IP in Brazil, where those 2 nonprofits are really trying to restore this very fragmented landscape here that we are seeing. So we have this huge block of protected forests here. We have a lot of fragments, and they are creating those wildlife corridors to connect those fragments and connect those fragments with the protected area here. And we are really trying to understand if the biodiversity are actually birds and frogs and mammals are using those wildlife corridors. So we deploy 120 devices in 120 locations. We have more than 1 million recordings coming from this study. We use the same kind of models, the pattern matching and the CNN models. We were able to detect 187 species across all sites. We again pass through the same model approach where we combine presence and absence with environmental variables, and so that we can get species richness, composition, distribution. In this case, specifically, we didn't use climatic variables. We use more land use variables. So we are trying to understand like how much of those are the variables that we use in the model, like the proportion of forest, NDVI, proximity to rivers and streams, the proportion of farming and connectivity. And it's super interesting to see how species are really responding to these conservation initiatives. Some species like this one are only occurring at the border of the fragments and the forest. Other species like this one are really only occupying where you do have forest remaining. And other species, some species are actually occurring outside forests. They prefer the agriculture matrix, and some species like this dove here is everywhere. So what we did was really to combine and create like a multi-species occupants model where you can still, like, maybe it's not easy to see, but you can see that, you know, like the occupancy are really tracking those wildlife corridors when you look at the landscape level. And one of the interesting results as well is that we have found that the number of species in forest areas and restoration are similar and higher than farming, right? Which is great, really indicating the positive effect of restoration in the area. But when you look at the species composition, the things are a little bit different. When you look at the composition, the restoration sites are still more similar to the farming sites than the forest areas, indicating that, you know, like, we still need to put a little bit more time and effort on these restoration initiatives. This is just like a different way to see the same results. Like here we're seeing the effect of restoration over the bird community. So we have like all the birds here, and everything that is in this side of the graph is telling us that we actually, the species are favoring, are occupying those sites that are being restored. And so it's really impressive. A lot of species are responding positively to restoration, which is great. But again, when you look at the composition, the story is a little bit different, not different, but you can really understand what is happening, because most of the species that have this positive effect, they are responding well to restoration, are actually generalist species, right? We do have like a large proportion of forest species that are also positively responding to restoration, but we still have a lot of forest species that are not, you know, like seeing the difference yet. So overall, what we are seeing is the restoration sites are able to host a similar number of bird species as protected areas, which is super interesting, especially considering that the oldest sites have only 10 years. So with like relatively quickly, species are responding to the restoration efforts. But it's still, like I said, when we look at the composition is still different between forest and restored areas. We are still missing some of the specialist species in the restored areas. Just to finalize, and I promise that I will shut up in a few minutes, that is the only, I just want to contrast this restoration project in Brazil with this restoration project in Indonesia, where here we are comparing how biodiversity responding through 4 land use types: primary forest, restoration, eucalyptus, and oil palm. And the results is super interesting as well, because we could see that in primary and restoration, we have more than the double of species than eucalyptus and oil palm, which is super interesting, kind of like obvious, but also in this case, composition of species are similar between restoration and primary forest, indicating that, you know, like the restoration efforts are really making a difference. So I just want to finalize and you know, like with this idea, I always want to finalize by sharing with you like what I envision, you know, like the vision that I have for continuing improving the way that we are monitoring biodiversity. So number one, I really hope that I showed you guys how impactful can be acoustic monitoring, but also this is my vision, a vision that we can really not only use acoustic, but also eDNA, point counts, camera trap to create these long-term biodiversity stations all across the world, so that we can really get information, hopefully in real time, so that we can really track how species are responding to both human and natural disturbances, and we can act quickly to protect and conserve those species. So I think that is pretty much it. Thank you so much again. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone.